Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. Shane Beamer, South Carolina, wrapping up fall camp. To the South Carolina fans who've been rocking with the boys throughout the month of August, y'all already know this. We've talked about almost every player on this roster over the last couple of weeks. I figured the best way to wrap up fall camp is to focus in on the players that have generated the most amount of buzz going into 2025. The players that in fall camp put a stamp on what they're going to mean to this program going into the 2025 year. Now, we're going to get nitty gritty with it. I do want to start with a more broad takeaway that I have about this program coming out of fall camp. I think they're going to be a more balanced football team than I thought they were going to be, going back to how we talked about this team in the spring. What I mean by that is, look, I have a ton of confidence in the offensive side of the football. I think you could make the argument that they are better at every position group on the offensive side of the football going into 2025. Like, if you run it down for just a moment, hey, Lenore Sellers going to get better going into year two as a starter. As good as he was last year, there's a lot of meat left on the bone, and everything we've heard is that Lenore Sellers is taking a step. Look at the running back room and say, if Rasul Faison gets his eligibility, which Shane Beamer maintains positive feedback in terms of him getting that year, it's going to be a better running back room. Not only with a guy like Rasul Faison, but is a significantly deeper running back room than what we saw last year. The wide receiver position is probably the biggest misconception that a lot of national media members have about South Carolina, where they're going to look at this wide receiver and they're probably going to recognize one name, and that is Nick Harbor. A guy that we know is supremely talented, but hasn't necessarily putting it all together over his first 2 years at South Carolina. Outside of that, I don't even know if they'll be able to tell you one other name in the wide receiver room. The feedback that we've gotten out of South Carolina going back to the spring, and it has maintained through fall camp, is that this wide receiver room has the ability to be a lot better than what it was in the 2024 year. You go back to 2024, outside of Joshua Simon, the pass catcher room wasn't all that good for South Carolina in 2024. I think it's going to be a lot better in 2025. And you look at the offensive line and say it's more talented and it's deeper. This is the deepest offensive line that Shane Beamer has had at South Carolina, and it ain't even close. So I'm looking at the offense and say, hey, we should be able to score on just about anybody in the country going into 2025. My bigger concern was we had some significant question marks on the defensive side of the football, specifically in the front seven. My biggest takeaway in fall camp is, look, I ain't going to get up here and say South Carolina is going to run back a top 15 defense in the country like they had last year. I do look at it and say it's not going to be as big of a problem. And I would even go as far to say, hey, we might have the opportunity to lean on the defense if we need to help us win games in 2025. That was not something I said about South Carolina going back to spring. But what we're hearing specifically from some of these members in the front seven is, hey, we should be better than we thought on the defensive side of the football. So I look at this South Carolina team and say it's going to look a little bit different. I think it's going to be a little bit more led by the offense, but I think we can still lean on this defense to keep us in some football games and possibly win us some football games in the 2025 year. That's my general takeaway. Want to get into some nitty-gritty players that have kind of separated themselves during fall camp before we get into it. And as always, to the South Carolina fans, appreciate you guys. Been a freaking blast talking this football team. And the amount of support this fan base has shown to the boys has been amazing. Appreciate you guys. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Hey, I do have some – I started my week one prep here. I do have some early thoughts and opinions on that Virginia Tech matchup that I will share at the end of the episode. Without further ado, let's get into some fall camp winners. And to me, the biggest storyline in fall camp are these freshman wide receivers. Again, this is why I think South Carolina is probably underrated. Is I think a lot of people assume this offensive line going to be the same. I think a lot of people have question marks about the wide receiver room. I mean, the two ones I want to focus in on, Brian Rowe and Donovan Murph. What stands out to me about both of these freshman wide receivers is one, loved them both coming out of high school. Number two, and more importantly, it's been consistent. It's not all that rare that you have freshmen that flash at times in fall camp. What is rare is when these freshmen show up every single day of fall camp and continue to make plays and are consistent. That's the feedback that we're getting from South Carolina. Now, I would even throw in Nick Carbon. I get he's not a freshman. I mean, Nick Harbor, first full offseason focusing on football. You saw him probably start to turn the corner late in that 2024 year. I'm looking at this wide receiver room and say it wasn't good in 2024. It was a bottom half pass catcher room in the conference last year. It has the opportunity to surprise a lot of people in 2025. So we're talking about Lenore Sellers taking the step going into the 2025 year, having better pieces around you, having better weapons around you, certainly going to help you take that step. These freshman wide receivers, they've made it very clear. And you could throw in Malik Clark. You could throw in a guy like Jaden Sellers. But to me, Donovan Murphy and Brian Rowe are the guys that I'm looking at the most to really elevate this offense going into 2025. Now, the other storyline, the other reason I'm a believer in South Carolina is this offensive line. I'm looking at it and saying, I like what I see on paper. And I look, do we still have question marks about how it's all going to come together? Yeah, absolutely. What I do know about South Carolina, there's a lot of talent. I mean, there's a lot of blue chip talent in this room, but also like there's a lot of depth. I mean, I'm looking at 8, 9 guys that South Carolina might trust to play quality football for them in 2025. There are a lot of programs across the country that don't even have 5 guys they trust. I think South Carolina has a lot. You know, the two names that have stood out to me the most, Shed Surratt, probably going to be starting left guard. I mean, you look at that and say, South Carolina under Shane Beamer, they've played some freshman offensive linemen. They've had to play those freshman offensive linemen a lot of times out of necessity, especially when you go back to 2023 with guys like Tree and Trevon Boss starting as freshmen. They clearly weren't ready. And that was one of the worst offensive lines that we saw in the SEC, if not the worst. In 2025, it feels different. Like Shed Surratt winning that left guard job over a guy like Nick Sharp, that tells me Shed Surratt is ready to play because Nick Sharp's a quality football player. Then the other thing is, hey, Tree Babalade getting some work at right tackle, potentially going to be your starting right tackle. Case and Henry, it wasn't perfect from this kid in 2024, but in the back half of the year, it was pretty dang good. So if you're telling me Tree going into year 3, a very promising offensive lineman who we think can be a very good football player, you're telling me this staff thinks that Tree might be a better option than Case and Henry. The only thing I can take away from that is that Tree Babalade might be ready to be a really good football player right now in 2025. It's a big offensive line. This is a physical offensive line. They're going to want to run the football. I think they can do that behind this offensive line in ways they could not in the past. That's my belief in South Carolina on offense. Is I think the two position groups that people have the biggest question marks about, I'm looking at and saying, I got a lot of confidence going into 2025 for both of these position groups. Now, on the defensive side of the football, these are kind of where the real storylines kick into play. I mean, I think number one, it's Nick Barrett, right? And what's been the conversation that we've had around South Carolina throughout the offseason is, hey, how can we stop the run? We have to replace so much production in the middle of that defensive line. We have to replace a guy like Kyle Kennard, and we more importantly have to replace a lot of our off-ball linebackers. I look at South Carolina's pass rush and secondary and say, hey, if you want to throw the football in South Carolina, good luck. You got to block Dylan Stewart. You got to throw on a secondary that we think is going to be really good. The biggest concern is we got a lot of teams on our schedule that are going to want to run the football. Can we stop the run at the level we need to go out and win 10 football games? Guy like Nick Barrett, like, look, he is the definition, the poster boy of why South Carolina has had a lot of success going back to 2024. You get these guys out of high school, they might not be ready to be year one impact guys. You get them marinating in the system. You know, Nick Barrett's now going into year 5, and it's his turn. I think we were operating under the assumption that a guy like Nick Barrett can't play. Well, Nick Barrett was behind some really, really good players last year. it sounds like Nick Barrett is having the best fall camp that he's had at South Carolina. Talk about presence in the run game. Nick Barrett has that. That's a really, really big body. And so Nick Barrett's a name that I think is going to have to play a lot of football. It sounds like he's having a really good fall camp. Going to be crucial for South Carolina to have that presence in the middle of that defensive line, stopping the run. And then the off ball backers. I mean, the feedback that I'm getting from these linebackers, it's awesome because we knew they had the talent. South Carolina, from an athletic profile standpoint, I think they got some of the better athletes at the linebacker position that you might see in the conference. You talk about Sean Murphy, talk about Fred Johnson, you talk about a guy like Justin O. These dudes, they're really, really gifted. The problem was combined all of these names. The four top linebackers in this room, this is a crazy stat. They have combined for 300 total defensive snaps. That is half the number that Debo played alone for South Carolina last year. And so, as much as we know this unit is talented, we haven't really seen them play much football. It is the most inexperienced linebacker room that you might see in the country at the Power 4 level. What we're hearing from this unit is that they have the opportunity to be really good. That is massive for the South Carolina defense. So I'm going back to how I thought about this unit in the spring, and it was like, nervous about it. Don't really know what I have in that room. To We still have to see it on the football field, but we're hearing all the right things. My confidence in South Carolina's ability to stop the run is significantly higher right now than it was back in the spring months. That's what fires me up the most. And the last name, Brandon Cisse, Brandon Cisse. I apologize for saying his name. I think I've said his name wrong pretty much all off season long, which is a damn shame because I freaking love this kid. Loved him at NC State. Comes to South Carolina immediately, wins that other boundary cornerback job opposite a guy like Judge. You got awesome boundary cornerbacks. You have a phenomenal nickel in Jalen Kilgore. It gives you not only the depth that you want in the SEC, because we like Vicari, we like Miles Norwood, but you're really deep. You also have some versatility. Like if you want to play a guy like Brandon at nickel and maybe move Jalen Kilgore back to safety, you can do that if you're South Carolina. This secondary should be one of the best units that you see in the conference, which inherently can take a little bit of pressure off your defense stopping the run. Hey, we can get creative with how we want to use our safeties, drop them down, support the run, because we know we have cornerbacks that can handle their business on the outside. This secondary should be the engine of South Carolina. And when you have cornerbacks you trust, you can start getting creative with how you want to stop the run with your front seven using your safeties. Early look at Virginia Tech. There are a couple of things that I want to note. Number one, can this South Carolina football team impose their will on Virginia Tech? One of the things that stood out to me when I was doing my prep on Virginia Tech is I'm not saying they're bad on the defensive line because they have a couple of names that I like. They're small. I mean, they're a top four interior defensive linemen, the guys that we expect to play the most amount of football. It averages about 290 pounds. It's a small unit. Then you look at South Carolina's offense, say that offensive line in terms of average weight is probably around 330, 320 pounds. Can South Carolina go to Mercedes-Benz Stadium, neutral site, impose their will on the ground against Virginia Tech? And then the second thing is I'll look at Virginia Tech and say, all right, Kyron Drones, a guy that we know is talented, a guy that we know is a very difficult quarterback to deal with. Virginia Tech lost their starting center to LSU. They lost their starting left tackle, Xavier Chaplin, to Auburn. Both guys that will be NFL draft picks in 8 months. They got a lot of new faces, green faces, a lot of moving parts on the offensive line. That you don't want to have that. You don't want to have to be ushering in a new left tackle when you got a guy like Dylan Stewart coming off the edge. Can this South Carolina pass rush take over the game? Because as much as I might have question marks about South Carolina stopping the run, I don't have any question marks about them getting after the passer. It's not only Dylan Stewart. Like, it's Brian Thomas on the other side. It's a couple of guys in the middle of the defensive line that are kind of that TJ Sanders kind of player that can get after They might not be the biggest defensive lineman, guy like Troy Pikes, but they can get after the quarterback. Can Virginia Tech handle South Carolina with this pass rush? Those are the two things that I'm looking at earliest in that football game. Really looking for South Carolina to go out there and pose their will in the run game, though. We'll close it out there. Appreciate you guys rocking with it. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. We'll talk to y'all later. Peace.